So one of the things that I've created for this presentation is a graphic to unpack this idea of containers to hold learning. Often we go again and again to the well of writing, and the reality is a lot of writing nowadays is left, as they say, on the cutting room floor. For example, even in this presentation, had I scripted everything out for myself, most of the time as we start filming, some of that is left behind, and most of it you don't see. And so with that, it's not that writing becomes less significant, but it's not the container that is most frequently used nowadays in a lot of ways. It also is something that may act as a barrier for some students. So I'm thinking about the 30 level classes that students need for high school diploma earning in Alberta. If you come to the end and you haven't taken an options class 10, 20, 30, you may end up in a 30 class that has no prerequisite, but it might be law 30, or it might be something that sociology 30, something that you haven't necessarily thought of as a non-academic type of class. So even classes that appear to be very academic and very reading heavy can be modified for the containers that are used more frequently today. Speaking and representing or presenting, as I'm doing here, is definitely, maybe not the wave of the future. The English teacher in me rejects the idea that reading and writing is over. It's definitely not. But a lot of the times, those containers can become a barrier, especially in a year where we're not able to give as detailed or in-depth instruction or one-to-one feedback as frequently as we might in other years. So to understand this graphic, what I would suggest you think about is starting with this idea of the top and the bottom. So the top is the learning zone. It's the inhale. It's the materials that we take in, the mentor pieces that we look at and consider. It's not a passive inhale. There's definitely a lot of action that happens with reading, viewing, and listening, understanding what it is that we're seeing on the page or on the screen, understanding how to unpack that, understanding how an author has created those things, or text creator has created those things. But it's very definition heavy. It's that lower part of the Bloom's taxonomy where you're thinking about knowledge and understanding and application, understanding the theory, understanding the broad concepts, but you might not yet at this stage have an innate understanding of how to then create those things yourself. So often we have, I think about, social. I definitely in high school had a wonderful social teacher, but so much of my job was to sit and listen. And a lot of the time, that didn't happen because my attention was wandering somewhere else because I wanted to talk instead. And that's still true today. So if we think about a lot of the times the inhale, in some classes might have a very heavy emphasis on that inhale and very little emphasis on the exhale or that growth zone. So imagine if back in the day I had been allowed to speak in social. I have lots of ideas about all kinds of things and many opinions. And so I probably would have liked to talk for a long time, and maybe my social teacher did as well. But maybe we were sort of ships passing in the night, missing the point of that, right? If we're both talking and nobody's listening, well, what are we solving? And so if we think about how we might use these containers, think about the top zone as what we might take in or consider. But the top zone is what we generate and create in the bottom, in the exhale. So if we're reading the great work of a text creator, we should then be thinking about how are we writing about this work? How might we borrow from what they have created and done and use in our own ways? Same thing for if we're viewing something. What are we then creating that is a visual container? What can we show in a way that's not focused on only written response, but maybe allows students to visually represent their ideas or make connections in a more visual or even a physical way? Same thing for the listening speaking. There's room for that instructional guidance and those wonderful lectures. But if I never get to talk and I never get to share my sides of things, that's a tough sell. And it also doesn't necessarily help me understand how to do the thing that you're showing me that you're great at. So take me into that experience, show me the nuts and bolts, and have me go through that same process of development. And here I've come away from your class with a very different level of understanding, not just of the content and the topic, but also of the execution of this subject area. So in the learning zone, we go from this usually point of fear, especially this year as students came back and hadn't written anything in the pandemic. They were shaking in their shoes a little bit about, how do I do this? Am I way behind? Have I, ruined my life? Am I failing forever? And they forget that no, it just takes some time and some muscle building. So generally what comes at the very beginning of understanding a subject is some interest, but maybe some intimidation as well. We might think, okay, I can never do that. Well, we haven't yet, but doesn't mean that we can never could. So once we move past that first layer of intimidation or fear, and it can be a big layer, especially if you're a grade 11 student in a -2 class and you haven't had a successful mark on a writing assignment since grade 5. How do we get past that, right? Confidence building might be the key step at the beginning. Once we move past that first initial stage of intimidation, we start to build muscles. This is not fun yet. This is not, I'm great at this thing and it all comes together and look at what I've created. This looks like a mess. And what am I even doing here? And what's the point of this? And, how did you do that? So there's a lot of muddiness, a lot of grit and grinding things out and going through the process of building the muscles that can come soon after we get past that fear. What I try to have students do is bypass as quickly as possible those first 2 stages to do an initial thing that'll help them get into the flow or the point of what it is we're doing. So if I know that in the long run our assignment is going to be a speech, I might have them start with a 30-second introduction to their neighbor about themselves. I might go from there to ask the class, hey, were there any amazing people that we want to hear from? Maybe you could share for a minute about what you guys talked about. We can scaffold up so that they get a sense and a taste of why this will be fun and useful in the long run without having to stay in that flex stage for a really long time. The flow will get better and easier and more quickly accessible with the flex work. So often once we are in learning about a process or about how to execute something, we're going back and forth between the flex and the flow. And the flow is the fun part. That's where we want to stay. I love this. I could just, speak forever about this topic. Oh, don't make me visually represent it. I don't want to do that. It's too hard. I haven't figured that out yet. I have to do more flex work before it becomes fun. So finding ways to sort of bridge that back and forth between the flex and flow is a great way to go. And the end result of the flow is not going to be the same for every student. It will depend on where they've come from and what they've come through, and also what they're willing to do flex-wise to build those muscles. So at the other end here in the growth zone, if we think about what we're aiming for in the long run, this is not about what we want students to execute for the mark in class. This is about, in the long run, who they are and can become as learners and members of society. So can they learn through this process to create, to see that, oh, I could never do that. Man, how did you ever figure out how to do that or make that? Doesn't have to be the place that you live forever. You can start to unpack and you can go through the process of learning how to do the thing and recognizing that, yeah, you don't have the expertise today, but it's not the end. Today is not over. So having that sense of possibility and the ability to believe that they can create is a huge piece that comes from this kind of practice. Communication definitely is going to be improved, especially if we're thinking about these different 6 strands. So I am coming from an English language arts perspective, and we have the 6 strands that we work with: read, view, listen, write, represent, speak. But they translate into all subject matters. This is why English is such a big subject, is that our topics and content can be all kinds of things, but our execution is everywhere. It comes into play in all other subjects as well. We read in every subject. We view and listen in every subject. And so these skills in English transfer all over the place and can be used to teach different subjects and also to measure success and hold learning products for other classes as well. So learning how to communicate and share your ideas is core in English, but it's also part of the curriculum for every other subject matter. And what the containers look like might have these foundations, even if it's a lab report in science or an experiment in biology. You might have to read through, and then you might have to speak about what you've learned by the end. So these foundational skills transfer and communication is really a theme across the board. Finally, the last piece of that growth zone graphic there, empathize. If we can, listen to others and read others' work and view others' work, we might build empathy for who they are. but how do we build empathy and understanding from them to us? We have to be able to share our own stories. We have to be able to have, authentic audiences that engage us and challenge us and make us feel afraid for a minute and then do it anyways. So all of these pieces can really help students understand how they might reveal their learning and also how they might share who they are with the world around them.